Hello, and welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. I'm Clarissa Benfield, our Global Director and Business Line Leader for our medical and laboratory businesses at Intertek. And today I am so thrilled to be joined by one of our technical experts, Zach Assenmacher. Zach, thanks so much for joining.
Hello.
So happy to have you joining us today. So I always like to get our podcast episodes started just with a brief, introduction to yourself, how long you've been at Intertek, what your passions are, interests in the industry, before we dive into some of our questions and topics for today.
Sure thing. So I'm Zach. I've been with the company for close to 3 years now. My main area of expertise and where I do a lot of my work is patient monitors. My specific interests are in the thermometry and alarm systems groups, but I do a lot of work with a lot of different patient monitor functions, and that's all covered under, the 601 body of standards.
Yes, absolutely. So happy to have you here today as someone who spends a lot of time with manufacturers in the day in and day out, talking about testing, talking about what's required, and really looking at, how you can best be prepared for testing. So when we think about it, right, we have conversations with people from startups, mid-sized companies, large medical device manufacturers, right? When we say you're getting ready for your testing, right? What does that really mean when someone needs to be ready or getting ready for their testing of their medical device?
So generally speaking, if you're getting ready for like your final push for certification, right? At this point, most of your design documentation should be frozen and ready. You should have a lot of your, pre-provided checklists in hand for risk management and usability and anything that applies to your product specifically. And you should also have a really good idea at that point of what kind of applied parts and classifications your medical device would have. Is it a device that has to comply with the alarm standard in 1-8? Is it a device that is intended for the home healthcare environment that has to comply with 1-11, that kind of stuff? So you should have a pretty good idea, or at least a fully good idea, of where those things lie with regard to your product.
Yeah. So when we're actually, having someone who's ready to get started with testing, we're generally seeing kind of in that end phases, as you say, right, getting ready for certification. But of course, we also will work with medical device manufacturers early on in their development stages, right? If they want to come in for spot check testing or preliminary testing, or if there's, an upgrade to the standard, like what we saw with 3 to 3.1, and they want to test something or try something out, or a new part 2 or something like that, we can do early phase testing. But generally, if we're talking about, okay, are you actually ready to start your project? Are you ready for your testing? You're going to have a finished sample ready to go that will be representative of what the product will actually be like.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Yeah. So that's kind of the stage that we're looking at, in the overall process of where they should be. Are there things that you think they should be considering at that point? Obviously said the documentation has to be done. Are there other things that in general, you as an engineer, when you're about to get started on a project, or you're getting a final product in to start testing, are there other things that you're looking for from someone aside from, of course, all of the documentation and the checklists and things that we provide?
So it kind of depends on the project, right? If this is the first time you're pushing a new product through, the process for that is a little bit more involved than it is if there's an update or a standard update that you've made to the product that we're trying to re-certify for. So we would be looking for, if it's an already existing product, we would be looking for something like, do you have a change description document that outlines all the changes you made, the board revisions, the component changes, the new components, that kind of stuff? If there's any functional changes, major functional changes, or functional additions to the product. Other than that, if it's, pushing a product through for the first time, we would be looking to likely at least email back and forth a little bit, talking about the major things like that, right? The things that we need to be aware of when it comes to figuring out how to solve reports and stuff like that.
Yeah. And with the testing specifically, a lot of times people will ask, do you need one sample? Do you need multiple samples? Do I need to provide accessories if I have multiple models? So in general, from your perspective, when you're getting ready to start a project and you see that there's maybe multiple samples, multiple models, multiple accessories, what can people be prepared to supply if they're, okay, we're getting ready for our testing, we want to be ready to go? What are we generally going to ask for, knowing that there can obviously be differences depending on product types or the types of testing that we're doing? But in general, what are you looking for when you're looking for actual samples to begin testing?
So generally, we would be looking for if you have a bunch of different configurations, right? Like a patient monitor that has thermometry and a couple different kinds of like pulse oximetry equipment, right? We would be looking for at just to start generally one of each configuration, just so that we cover everything across the array. And then from there, if depending on the scope of the project, how we evaluate from there, it's a good idea to just have one of everything available on hand, right? And that would include accessories too, because accessories still they have their own quirks, let's say, that we have to kind of navigate a little bit when it comes to how they're evaluated with an end product.
Yeah. So I think depends on the situation, but always be prepared that it's not just going to necessarily be one single sample, especially when you're dealing with accessories or different models or different families.
Yeah.
I think too, one of the things that obviously will come up a lot, especially since you've been involved in a lot of testing, sometimes we see people come in that maybe aren't as prepared as they could be when they're coming in for their testing. So are there some common like mistakes that you see or oversights or things that, really impact what's going to happen with the testing if people come in and they're not prepared?
So, kind of going back to what we said earlier, like knowing the scope of the changes if you're making changes to an existing product, knowing what kind of classifications apply to the product you're looking to certify, and understanding how that fits into the scope of the project you're doing, whether it's a not-for-record test where you're looking to evaluate to a newer version of a standard, or whether it is just like we're pushing a product through for the first time. You want to have a good enough idea of what it is the scope of your project is. And then some of the things that we've seen, there's the checklist having documents that don't quite match the ones we're provided, right? We're given a newer revision of a document than is listed in the checklist, and we have to kind of go back and forth with them a little bit to figure that out. Making sure that all of the accessories are provided is a good one. That's one we've seen fall a couple times. Just making sure that you have everything, like all of the I's dotted and the T's crossed, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when we think about people coming in unprepared, a lot of times that can lead to delays. It can lead to additional time, as you said, back and forth, especially on the documentation. Obviously a big change when risk management was introduced. Now people are much more familiar with it. But to your point, not having all of those documents, not having your critical component information, not having your IFU or at least a draft, right? All of those kind of things can lead to additional time delays, right? Especially if we see manufacturers who are on a tight schedule or who are looking to really understand, okay, we want to be as ready as possible and we don't want to have those delays. It's so important that you're communicating early and back and forth and getting all of the documentation ready, plus anything that's needed for actual testing. So that way, when you get started, you can really be at a very smooth place, to start from and move forward.
Yeah, the critical component one is a really good call out. We've seen a couple times where customers just say, okay, so we're replacing this part in the product with this component with another one, right? And we have to kind of understand, like, well, is this something that's going to be done in perpetuity? Is this we ran into some supply chain issues and have to replace it for now, and we're going to go back to the other one when it's available. Understanding, is this design change you're making permanent? Is this going to be an alternate component or replacement component? That kind of stuff we've seen a little bit too.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and always, good to ask those questions up front, do the back and forth before you're coming in that day to start your testing. So that way you really understand what we're asking for and you can have that, clear guidance to move forward.
Yeah. Having those conversations ahead of time is always huge. That helps us a lot.
Absolutely. One of the questions that, comes up a lot, I think, from manufacturers is when they're starting to make decisions about their design or changing materials. You talked a little bit about that, right? Scoping all of your changes, but, looking to change a different material or a power source, adding a battery, or, now we see so many of these devices, deciding to connect, right? We see a lot more connectivity in medical products, smaller medical products, even in some that are, going into hospitals and clinics and things like that. So when people are making these design decisions from a manufacturing standpoint and starting to add or subtract or change things, how does that really impact their testing or how the testing is going to be done? I think sometimes people think maybe things are more simple than they might be and may not impact testing. So from your perspective, when you're looking at that, how do those kind of changes impact testing?
So the way I like to kind of approach that stuff is just looking at it from the biggest picture possible, right? Like the 601 standard series it's very broad in scope and it applies to a lot of different stuff. But it kind of loses some of the finer details. Like it doesn't have an official recognition for like the universal serial bus, right? It doesn't denote the USB as an industry standard for any kind of electrical product. So it doesn't have specific carve outs for something like that. So when I say look at it from the biggest picture possible, you have to look at, well, if you're adding a USB port, how does that affect things like your ingress protection rating? How does it affect what you're able to access from the outside of the product if you're just poking around with your hand? What like electrical metal, what electrical metal parts can you access with it? Like that kind of stuff. Look at it from the biggest picture possible, and then from there, just kind of go forward and figure out like what is changing, what are we doing differently, and how can that create problems?
Yeah, and even the most minor things can obviously sometimes, lead to quite a bit of testing. I think the connectivity is a big one, right? So we see people starting to incorporate wireless technology, 5G, Bluetooth, whatever it might be, and that could cause a lot of additional testing, maybe not on the safety side, but a lot on the EMC side. Same thing, you think, oh, it's simple to just swap out a power source. Oh, we're changing this over to a battery, or we're adding a different power supply, but that can add a lot of additional testing, based on conditions of acceptability and all of those things. So it's important to weigh those design decisions as you're going through that process to say, hey, is this worth it from a financial perspective to test, and add all of these things, or does it make more sense to wait to a new iteration or a new revision or model of the product?
Right. You mentioned like Bluetooth or 5G connectivity. One of the big things that we see a couple times is software updates to products still have to comply with like the general usability of the product itself. So 601 requires that you do some usability evaluations. You have to determine like, is this going to impact the essential performance to the product or the operator's ability to use it? And if you're adding connectivity and stuff like that, a lot of times you still want to make sure that it's not going to impact the essential performance of your product. Whoever is using it within the scope of however well they're supposed to be trained, or if it's just meant to be something you buy at like a store, you still have to make sure that the new features you're adding aren't going to impact that in any way, right? It still is what goes wrong if the Bluetooth radio starts acting funny because it's near a microwave, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that totally leads right into this idea of, with risk management and how that can actually play a role in the testing. I think previously manufacturers thought, well, maybe we don't have to provide all of our risk management documentation up front. Maybe we can do that at the end. Maybe we can just start testing. But obviously, to your point, there are instances pulling from usability, pulling from the 60601 checklist, pulling from PET, right? There are instances where that might impact test planning and how you're doing your testing.
Right. Yeah. If you want to look at the 601 series as like a skeleton, right? You have the actual requirements are like the bones of the skeleton that tells you, how is it able to stand on its own? How is it safe to use? The risk management acts a lot like cartilage in that way. Like it goes in places where the requirements can't fully go. It helps connect some of these other things together. It's as important as the rest of the requirements are, right? It's a huge part of the third edition of 601. So it is as important, if not more important sometimes than the actual product itself, and how the manufacturer chooses to evaluate through their risk management process and how that changes and drives design changes as well.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because, of course, we're now going through this whole evolution as well with the new standard that's going to be coming out, the new version of 60601 in a few years, which is going to move a lot back towards, more testing, maybe away from some of the risk management requirements. So if people are interested in that, we've done a couple of webinars on it. So definitely something to keep your eye out for. But as it exists right now, right, risk management can really dictate how the evaluation is done and how the testing is performed. So it's important to really understand that those things go hand in hand when you're submitting your product and wanting to be ready for testing. You have to be considering, what changes in the risk management could change how you perform testing.
Yeah, one of the things that I've told one of our bigger clients is that when you're looking at it through the way that third edition is written, right, risk management is almost as important as the product itself, and the same thing with like some of the supporting documents, like the instruction manual that comes with it, right? Those are all equally important parts of the process that interact with each other, that tell you what you're going to have to do. And in a lot of cases, your risk management modifies some of the testing you'll have to do or things like that. So it is a super important part of the current version of the standard.
Yeah, and I think that, really leads us into as well. So, as an engineer who's going through a project, doing an evaluation, can you walk us through what that typical process looks like? So for a manufacturer who's maybe new to the process or hasn't done this in a while, you have all of this readiness check, right? They prepare all the information, the documentation, they have their samples. Let's assume everything's ready to go. You have the product and the documentation on day one. you start with a construction evaluation, testing. Can you walk us through kind of how that looks when you're setting up your actual testing or your typical testing plan?
So when we first receive a new project, we'll take a look at the product and any documentation the manufacturer provided, whether that be changes to the risk management, change description documents. We'll take a look at the actual product itself, and do a construction evaluation, figuring out the major functions of the product, some of the things we might catch with a little bit of experience that could be tricky. Like I said, with like USB ports, there's usually some exposed metal shielding that might be a problem sometimes. That kind of stuff. We'll give the device a walkthrough for its major functions, its essential performances, anything we might think might be tricky, and then look at what testing is required for this product for this change scope, and kind of go from there and use the risk management as kind of like a guide rail that helps us along that process.
Yeah. And then, of course, we have the base standard, we have the particular standards. Obviously, sometimes we'll see part twos can change or impact the testing in the part one. So it's, all of that kind of molds together as you're putting together your test plan and deciding, okay, when are you performing what tests, destruct it, right? You have to go through that whole process.
Yes. Yeah. The part twos are tricky sometimes because they really modify a lot of what the general standard wants to see. One of the bigger ones is for blood pressure, non-invasive blood pressure stuff. Modifies a lot of those tests. It adds a lot of extra testing. Thermometry adds a little bit more, and then kind of modifies what it expects to see for like instrumentation controls and displays and that kind of stuff. That kind of goes back to earlier what I was saying, like understanding the scope of like what is your product required to meet in terms of the part ones and part twos.
Absolutely. And then, I think even along with that too, right, assuming that someone is ready to go, right, people are always looking for ways to make things faster, right, work on their timelines, reduce costs, reduce delays, reduce failures. I think, you explained it pretty well when we're talking about a revision, right, how important it is to outline, redline, identify, what changes you're making to the product, how that's impact, right? So really going through that process and being as thorough as possible can really help with delays and getting your project moving forward sooner. Obviously on the front end, if you're starting a new project, starting with a preliminary design review, preliminary testing, understanding if there's any major gaps, many errors up front. But are there other things that you see, that can help someone to reduce their timeline or to reduce failures or delays?
I think the biggest one is being responsive. Generally, when we're doing some kind of testing or evaluation, if we run into something that's not quite clear that we need some support on, we'll reach out right away. So if we have to kind of wait until we hear responses about, what is this document actually doing? Is this the right document reference? Is this the right revision? If we're waiting to hear responses and that kind of stuff, that can kind of kick out the schedule a little bit. And oftentimes it's unavoidable because everybody is as busy as they are. But being responsive when somebody reaches out about a project is super helpful. I mean, it can cut down days or even weeks sometimes about how long you're actually in your testing phases.
Yeah. And I think the other part with that too is asking questions, right? So again, if you're thinking of changing a power source, if you're thinking of making a significant change, you can always reach out and ask that question so you understand the impact, right? So you understand how long the testing might take, you understand what you're looking for. And again, doing some of that early testing, pre-compliance testing, pre-compliance work with the lab. So, if there are areas maybe of concern or new tests you haven't done yet, or tests you haven't tested to that level, you can have a little bit more understanding before you come in for your final testing to keep things moving a lot faster. But of course, I think your point is so great. I mean, we view this as a collaborative process back and forth. So it takes a lot on both sides. We understand it takes a lot from the manufacturer to get a medical device through the process. And so the faster with communication, the faster with sharing the materials that are being asked for, you can really save on those timelines.
Yeah. And even like reaching out ahead of time before the start of your project can sometimes be helpful too. Like one of our bigger clients, if they have a question about, what would we be required to update if we wanted to change a battery cell or if we wanted to swap out to a different charger, having them reach out ahead of time and we can tell them like, okay, if you wanted to do that, you would need to run these 3 tests. You would need to update your critical components list, all of that stuff. Reaching out and communicating more of that ahead of time instead of just like putting in a project and saying, we don't really know what we have to do yet, but this is the change we made to the product. That can also help us a lot too. It's a lot more collaborative in that way.
Yeah, exactly. Or expecting that you're going to have to do full retesting just because you're making a change, right? And that's never our approach, right? We're always looking for the delta and what actually needs to be done. So having that back and forth and being communicative is really important. Yeah.
Yeah. We actually had that as an issue with a recent client where They told us like, okay, so we changed a bunch of software and hardware features in the device, but they weren't really specific as to what the actual changes were. So they sent us the updated product and we did our construction review and didn't see a lot that was very different. There wasn't a lot of functional changes to the product. So we started testing and we got to the end of the project and we said, okay, so here's the information we need from you. We need, and if you could look over this updated critical components list, we want to make sure we're capturing everything before we put the reports in. And there wasn't really that many changes. So we spent a lot of time doing a bunch of testing that we ultimately might not have needed because they weren't like as communicative as we would have liked at the beginning. And that kicked the schedule out a little bit longer than it could have if they would have just told us at the beginning, like, hey, we only changed this isolator and this, diode or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's a really great, real world example. And we see other things, right, where maybe a manufacturer isn't 100% clear on what markets they're going to and tries to add a market at the last minute and say, oh, well, we want to actually go to Japan and Korea and Brazil as well. And then we know that that can add additional testing and delays and retesting, or someone reads something about CB scheme or ASCA and they want to add that on at the end. And so they have to go back and, reevaluate and do more testing. So I think there's a lot of, proactivity and real world examples that we could come up with that really just show, having those conversations up front, working on that test plan, knowing where you're going, identifying your markets can really help save you on all of those kind of pitfalls and cost and time delays.
Yeah, I think a client reaching out toward the end of the product and asking if they can add in ASCA is something that I wake up in the middle of the night scared about. Like that's not something you really want to hear toward the end of the schedule, especially because the ASCA program specifically is so involved at the beginning that if they say that at the end of a project, you just think, oh no, this might be a problem. So communicating ahead of time is a huge help for a lot of that stuff.
I mean, and thinking about that, obviously we talked about some examples of where maybe people are less prepared or not as prepared as they need to be. Can you think of any examples of someone who was like very prepared and that made it go so much smoother and so much easier because they knew and they were prepared early on and thinking about, what they needed to do for their testing?
Oh, absolutely. We were testing a thermometer device recently. It's just like a handheld thermometer. And prior to the project start, the client set up a meeting with us to go over like, okay, so here are the changes we're making. We're adding this different component. We're changing something else. We're not really changing much about the product. And we had a meeting with them very early on in the process to determine what is it that we actually have to test. And they had a whole spreadsheet of all of the testing that they think applies from 601. And we went through it and said, well, if you're just changing that component, you don't have to do these 4 tests. And sitting down with us early on in that process really helped a lot. It cut down the amount of time we spent going back and forth. It cut down the amount of testing they had to do. It allowed us to get the project finished sooner. It was such a breeze that I wish I could do that for every single project.
Yeah.
So being involved that early is super helpful.
Well, and I think too, it's so interesting because I think sometimes manufacturers are under the impression that maybe we don't want to know what their thoughts are, or they can't come to us with the test plan, or they can't come to us with rationale. So oftentimes, right, a manufacturer is going to know their product much more intimately and better than we do. So if they have an idea like, hey, we want to make this change, we think we need to test these things, it's like, yes, come to us, we'll have that discussion. It's always going to be the back and forth. So I think it's just such a great example too, where it's like, we're wanting to hear from the manufacturer and work together. We'll learn from them, they'll learn from us, and we'll come up with the best plan for testing. It's never going to be, black and white in terms of medical devices and how we test the products and evaluate them for compliance.
Yeah, it's a lot of understanding that, as much as we're here to do the testing and prepare the reports and all that, we're also here to help you get ready for that stuff as well, right? So the more involved you get with an upcoming project, the better it is for everyone. It's going to be easier on the engineers. It's going to be easier on the technical staff on the side of the manufacturer that have to kind of respond and wait, and it makes the process so much smoother. I can't say enough how much easier it is the earlier you get involved.
Yeah. And we hinted, of course, at the new version of 60601 that is coming, right? 4th edition. It is coming. We have all of the working groups in process right now, working on building out the new version of the standard. There's going to be a lot of changes, right? A lot more type testing requirements. We have quite a bit of runway, right? We're looking at 2029, 2030. But are there other things, anything, from your perspective, again, you're doing this day in and day out, where you think, trends that you're seeing that are coming, or what you think medical device manufacturers should be doing or thinking about as they're preparing and getting ready to, come into our labs for testing?
So one of the things that we see a lot is sometimes when the standards aren't particularly clear about a test requirement or a classification, a lot of it falls back to basic safety and essential performance. Those are like the four keywords of the hundreds of pages that are in the 601 family, right? But from what I understand, the next version that is upcoming is going to be focusing a lot more on basic safety and essential performance. And whenever we have a question about like, well, how does this verdict actually work with what we observed with the device and how we tested it, we tend to fall back toward intended use and essential performance. And I was really glad to hear that essential performance is going to be a much bigger component of the next version, as far as I'm aware. So being prepared to understand that your device is probably going to have some essential performance requirements, and those might change with the new edition, but it'll help clarify a lot of what's going to happen in the future when you have to recertify to the new version. So, and it kind of goes back to what I said earlier about like understanding from the biggest picture possible. What does your device do? How does it do it? Those essential performance functions help you explore those a lot, and having a newer focus on essential performance is going to be very helpful for everybody.
Yeah. And I think too, just really starting to shift that mindset again, right? Basic safety and essential performance. It's going to be all about verification and validation, right? That's going to be a big component of 60601 with the fourth edition. So really, as manufacturers start to like get into that mindset and start thinking about it that way, understanding that there likely will be a lot more type test requirements for the different clauses within the standard. So, there's a long time to prepare. There's a lot that's coming, right? We know it's going to impact the industry a lot. We had a huge transition when we moved from the second to the third edition. Now it's going to be another big transition moving from the third edition series to fourth edition, but going to be some great changes. So as I said, we have done a few webinars on that. If people are interested, they can check those out. But really great to talk to you, Zach, about preparing for testing and what that means. So thank you so much for joining. Such great commentary. And if anyone has questions or would like to get in touch, you can always reach out to me, clarissa.benfield@intertek.com. And if you have any ideas or other things you'd like for us to cover on the podcast, you can always let me know. So thanks so much, Zach.
All right. Thank you. It was great to talk to you.
Yeah. Have a great day.
All right. You too.